member this week that I was going to preach about Jesus this Sunday, and she said, I'm not coming. Been there, done that, she said. But I said to her that I had preached for 6 years. This is my 6th Easter sermon with you all, and I haven't talked about the Christian part of the Easter story yet. It might be time. So I want you to know that I'm not going to tell you what you have to believe, and I'm not going to suddenly start talking about hell, because we don't believe in hell. So just be reassured, you're going to have to trust me. Some of you may wonder why I'm being so circumspect and hedging this all around with caveats from the very beginning, but others of you, perhaps triggered with some post-traumatic stress, will understand exactly why. So as I have told you before, one of the ways that has meaning to me to approach Bible stories is to approach them in a Jungian way, as if they were dreams. I am one of those people that the parable of the sower is about, and for those of you who are havens, I will tell you. Sorry, South Carolina word. I will quickly tell you the parable of the sower. Rabbi Jesus told this parable, and he said there was a person sowing seed, and some of the seed fell among weeds where it was choked out, and some of the seed fell along a hard packed path where it just couldn't get in, and other seed fell into fertile ground where it grew and lived happily ever after. Then I am the person who is, for Christian stories, a hard packed path. In my heart and in my life, in my mind and my spirit, those stories have been walked over again and again, and those places in my heart have been walked over and walked over and walked over and walked over until they're just packed so hard, really, it's hard to have anything sink in from that particular tradition. But that doesn't mean I want to deprive you all of that tradition, which may have richness in there for you, as it does for me, too, when I look at it with my healed Unitarian mind. So, any scripture can be approached this way, as if it were a dream, where the Hindu Upanishads or the Buddhist sutras or the Christian and Jewish scriptures. These are stories that have come up through the collected wisdom of humanity. Now, I was trained in Carl Jung from the time I was a baby. My Aunt Ruth was a Jungian analyst, so she talked to me about it. I studied it at Duke. I studied it at Princeton Seminary. Wrote papers about Jung from the time I was 17. And then I studied some more with a retired Jungian analyst named Polly Telford, who was retired from Connecticut, which is where you'd expect to find a Zurich-trained Jungian analyst, but not in Pea Ridge, North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains, where she had retired. But she taught me as well. So from all of those teachers, I was asked to picture the collective unconscious, the collected wisdom of humanity, and who knows what else, the collective unconscious as a large sea in which we are islands. And everybody's personal consciousness is like an island surrounded by the sea of human wisdom, stories, folk tales, faith tales, images, and sometimes they wash up on our shores, and sometimes they soak up through the earth of our the island that we are, and they appear. So you find wisdom in, as I said, folk tales and fairy tales and scripture, faith stories. So here we have the story of Rabbi Jesus. It's very probably not historical the way it happened, which is okay. It's true in other ways. And so Rabbi Jesus serves Western culture as a symbol of deep love, sacrificial love, and as a symbol of inner wisdom. So here's what happens to him. You need to know that the two syllables, Jesus, are a westernization of his actual name, which was Yeshua. So Yeshua, because we had Western supremacist culture, a Roman supremacist culture back then, in the land where he grew up. And so everything was all about the Romans. So he grew up, Yeshua, and he became a traveling teacher, and he had disciples. He was not the only traveling teacher with disciples. There were 13 or 14 of them, as far as we can tell from historians, right around the same time. But he is the one that we're talking about today. And he said things that got him in trouble with the authorities, both the political authorities and the religious authorities, because he said things that made people think unsafe thoughts about the authorities. He didn't foment revolution in any way. It's just who he was and how he acted. He had female disciples. Nobody did that. He talked respectfully to people of all social classes. Nobody did that. He said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but render unto God that which is God's. Well, Caesar was kind of supposed to be God back then. That got him in trouble. One of the things that he did during this, what we call Passion Week, I'm going to give you kind of a timeline. The first thing he did last Sunday, we celebrate Palm Sunday. By we, I mean those of us in Western culture and those of us who celebrate the Christian faith. Palm Sunday is when Rabbi Jesus, knowing he was in trouble with the authorities, came back to Jerusalem, walked toward his fear, and showed people who he was. What people were hoping, because people love a big military show of force, don't they? They were hoping he would come roaring into Jerusalem on a big horse, looking like a military conqueror, and that he was going to sweep the occupying forces out with force. But instead, he rode in on a donkey. That was deeply disappointing to some of his fans. It signaled that he was the Prince of Peace, not a Prince of War. It signaled he was going to do things a different way. So many of them said Hosanna anyway and laid palm branches, hence the name Palm Sunday, in front of the donkey as he came back into Jerusalem. And almost everybody was trembling because the authorities were going to come hurt him. Everybody knew that. Did he hide? No. Pretty much the first thing he did was go to the temple where people were changing money. Because, you have to have sacrifices. You buy little doves, you buy little lambs, and you make your sacrifice in the temple. And you've come for Passover from all over the Roman Empire. And so you speak different languages, you have different money. The money changers were in the temple. You know what Jesus did. He came in and he didn't just say, let's have a gradual discussion about how we could maybe change this culture of money changing in the temple. Let's change things gradually so nobody is uncomfortable. He came into the temple and he just took his hand and went whoosh, and turned the tables over. He scattered money everywhere. Pretty shocking. Made it look like he didn't care about money. Nobody doesn't care about money. He didn't like people getting cheated. He didn't like fees being paid. He didn't like handling and shipping fees being added to their cost of the doves. The interest being collected. He just stopped it right there. Then all during the week, he does things that are striking and somewhat odd. I'm going to tell you one of the odd ones because I just think it's interesting. One of the things he did was he stopped under a fig tree for shade, and it didn't have any figs. And so he cursed the fig tree. He just cursed it. And hence, when the Westboro Baptists come, some people hold up big signs that say, God hates figs. Because of this story. It's truer, maybe. And so, by Thursday, when they were having the Last Supper, people understood that Rabbi Jesus was not interested in changing things in a military way. He was not interested in the mother of all bombs. He was not interested in showing people, teaching people a lesson, whatever. He was interested in going to the root of things, which is why we say radical. Radical means somebody goes to the root of things. He was interested in radical change. And what is at the root of Roman supremacist culture? What was at the root of all of that? That sense that some people are better than other people. That sense that, well, the way things are the way they are. You know, we have the Roman rules and everybody just adheres to them because otherwise we wouldn't have peace in the empire. He wanted to make a radical change, but nobody really knew how that was going to happen. Okay, that last meal with his disciples, he is said to have said some shocking things. He broke the bread and said, this is my body. He poured the wine and said, this is my blood. They didn't really get what he was talking about, we think. The earliest account of this Last Supper was written 60 years after it happened. So who remembers exactly? One of his disciples had sold him out to the authorities, to the soldiers, and they came and got him. They took him before the puppet ruler, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was torn 5 different directions between the religious authorities and the political authorities, and he just wanted everybody to be happy and leave him alone so that he could live his puppet ruler lifestyle. And he engaged in a little philosophical discourse with Jesus. They say you bring the truth. What is the truth? Jesus really wasn't having any of it. He delivered him over to the soldiers to be tormented. They made him, they beat him up pretty badly. They made him carry his own cross to the place where they crucified criminals. He couldn't do it, apparently. He couldn't do it. And so they grabbed a guy out of the crowd, Simon of Cyrene. He did not volunteer. But when the Roman soldiers grab you by the arm and say, carry this, you carry it because you want to keep your life. It is said, and this is church tradition rather than actual Bible, it is said that a woman named Veronica came out of the crowd and offered him her veil to dry his tears. Church tradition, because it can never leave well enough alone, also said that, you know, he put her veil up to his face and it came away with an imprint of his face on it. My friends, why do people need that? Isn't it enough? Isn't it enough what was already happening? His face had to come away on the veil? Come on. Anyway, she was brave, and she emerged from the crowd. She didn't have to. You know, there's a wonderful Japanese proverb that says, the nail that sticks up will be hammered down. She didn't have to be the nail that stuck up. She didn't have to come out of the crowd, but she did. She was moved with compassion to help him. And then he was crucified alongside 2 other criminals. They left him there to die. There were some people, his mom stayed. And when he was dead, he was put in a cave-like tomb. There are hundreds of them all over Jerusalem. Those tombs from that period, you would have a cave-like opening, and then they would have a cube-shaped stone that they would shove onto the, like a cork, onto to the entrance to the cave. And some of the cave openings had round stones, but those were mostly queens and kings. So likely he had one that had a cubical stone. You can learn a lot. Your phone knows all of this. You just say to your phone, what were tombs like in the time of Jesus, and it'll give you pictures and everything from Biblical Archaeology Review. The story goes on that Sunday morning, 2 women came to minister to his body, and they found the tomb uncorked. It says the stone was rolled away, and biblical archaeologists, oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe the number of words that are spent talking about how, well, a cubical stone really could be rolled technically. Again, why do you need that? This is enough of a miracle, okay? The divinity became humanity, was joined with us in our brokenness, in the vicissitudes of life, in hunger and thirst and heartbreak and pain in the body, and then death. And then the tomb was empty. That's not enough. They have to quibble over whether the stone was rolled away or not. Come on. This story is a story of a human dynamic, and a story of a divine dynamic, and a story of the earth's dynamic. And a lot of times in ancient cultures, it is symbolized by a spiral. You go down, 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 down to the center, to the underworld, to death, and then you come back out again. There's a story that was written 1,600 years before Jesus lived. That's a Sumerian poem, modern-day Iraq, a Sumerian poem about a goddess named Inanna who went down, down, down into the underworld to go to her brother-in-law's funeral. And she was at each level of the underworld stripped of something else. She had to give up her crown. She had to give up her breastplate. She had to give up her belt. She had to give up her rings. Finally, her clothes. She was hung on a hook down there by her wicked sister. Hung on a hook for 3 days. She was dead. And then one of her helpers, a little fly, came buzzing down there and whispered in her ear, and she revived and came back up out again. So this is another spiral down into death, back up into life. It parallels the life of a seed, really. Anybody who's a gardener knows when you start a tomato, you put the little seed into the dark earth, and the seed sits in there for a little while until it breaks open. And then life comes up out of the brokenness and seeks the light, and out comes life again. So you're down in the earth, you're broken, life comes back. It's a parallel also with what happens over and over again in a human life, isn't it? I mean, each of us have experiences where we're stripped of everything. If you haven't had it yet, it's coming. Sorry. You lose people you love, you lose places you love, you're frustrated because you can't get something you love, you lose a job that was your identity, your business fails, or you can't conceive when you want to, or you have a heartbreak of any number of kinds, or you're falsely accused of something. You lose, you're stripped away, and finally you feel yourself might as well be dead. And the comfort of the Christian story is that the divinity, God, understands that dynamic, and not only understands from high above, like, oh yes, I've seen this many times, dear one, I'm so sorry you're going through this, but participated in it, in the brokenness. And so one of the points of this Christian story, I believe, is that brokenness is where the light comes in, like the Leonard Cohen song, the crack, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light comes in. Marianne Williamson, a great spiritual teacher, said she had a nervous breakdown spent some time in the hospital, and she said a nervous breakdown is a highly underrated path to enlightenment. Once you lose everything, you're stronger because you lose some of your fear. You know what it's like down there. We all have helpers in the journey of our brokenness. Somebody who carries things for us for a while, whether voluntarily or not, maybe because they are oppressed by the same authorities which are oppressing us. Maybe out of their compassion they help us. So I think the point of this story is not the point of the churchianity that I was raised with. Now, I say churchianity to separate it from actual Christianity. The churchianity says an angry God killed his son in order to be able to forgive sins, which makes no sense at all. You're God. You could forgive sins if you wanted to. Why you got to kill somebody? But, and it also seems like child abuse. I'm sorry if I'm speaking too harshly, but I've been to school. I've been to the end of this road. I know exactly what they teach. And at the end of the road, it doesn't make any more sense than it did in the middle. So, it seems like divine child abuse. So that cannot be true because God cannot be a worse parent than you are. Even you would know not to kill your child for some reason, unless you're, deranged. The point I would take from all of this is that, number one, if you are a disruptor of the system that benefits the powers that be, you're going to get in trouble. And you may as well ride toward it on a peaceful donkey. The reason he died is not because God needed him to die. He died because the powers that be needed him to die. And the deeper point is that love, great love, knows that life will break you, as Chris read. Life will break you. And the great love doesn't stand apart from us looking at us with pity, but participates in the brokenness with us. And then the great love brings life from brokenness and leads the way back up to the light. Again and again. May it be so.
Several years ago, I was serving on the board here at the church. This is before I went to seminary, and we were in the middle of a series of sessions within the congregation to discern what are now our values and our mission. The folks on the board had gone through one of the sessions first, and our job after that was to listen deeply as other members of the congregation participated in the process. I'll never forget the first session where I showed up to listen. I showed up in Housen Hall on a Saturday morning to see a group of folks who I knew were all self-identified atheists. Now, I also knew from having already done the workshop that a big part of it was sharing our experiences of the holy. So I was kind of thinking to myself, I wonder how this is going to work. 20 minutes later, we were passing around boxes of tissue as people told of times when they had felt connected to something larger than themselves. They had experienced awe and wonder. Their hearts had grown larger. So there sat our group of atheists in a church fellowship hall, dabbing tears from their eyes over sharing experiences of the holy. It was beautiful and moving, and it was holy. What this exercise did was to help us determine what values we had in common as revealed through these experiences, as well as to reclaim that word holy for ourselves. Then, combining these values with the results from some other exercises we did, the board was to suggest what the congregation held as its key purpose or mission. That's how we got the statement that we still have on our wall and still say together every Sunday. I start with that story because I don't think we talk about our values as often as we do our mission, nor do we talk about how both came to be, that the values came first. The mission emerged out of the values. It'll be important to remember that process as we live out and continue to assess our values and mission as we grow into our future. So this morning, I'm starting a series of sermons on each of our 5 religious values, starting with the one we list first because, transcendence in 20 minutes or less. Easy, no problem. I actually do think it's important that we start with our religious value of transcendence because I think there are good reasons that we ended up citing it first. Here's one of them. After those sessions I just told you about, we compiled the number of times each value was expressed by folks in the congregation and created one of those word art graphics where the ones that were mentioned the most often were shown in the largest font size, perhaps partially as a result of the way the sessions were structured. This is what we got. Transcendence and related words people had used to describe their experiences of it was clearly the largest in the graphic. Now, I think it's important to talk about what folks meant by transcendence. One meaning of the word can be to overcome, to rise above, and certainly we do, for instance, try to transcend oppression through our social justice efforts. What people were talking about here, though, was more about their experience of transcendence, an experience outside of their day-to-day experience of life, and awe and wonder at the unity of life. Science has begun to examine some of these types of experiences and has found that what people label as transcendent experience varies as to what seems to cause it, the exact nature of the experience, and the degree of intensity. But there does seem to be a common set of characteristics to these experiences. They include, 1, a sense of belonging and connectedness with others and with all of creation. 2, closely related to this, a sense of both dissolution of self and a flowing out or expansion outward toward a sense of unity with all that is. 3, an alteration of one's normal sense of space and time. 4, an ability to accept paradox. And finally, a perception of beneficial change in perspective and behavior afterwards. Now, these characteristics that I just listed are remarkably similar to exactly what our folks in Housen Hall on that Saturday morning said when they were describing their own experiences. Here's another reason why I don't think it's all that surprising that transcendence emerged as a value so strongly here at the church. While as Unitarian Universalists, we do come out of a tradition that has certainly always had a strong element of rationality and reason, so too has our tradition always contained a strain of finding truth and beauty through personal experience. And now these two things can sometimes be at odds with each other. Our transcendentalist forebears provide the obvious example. In the late 1800s, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker got themselves into trouble not just with the conservatives of their time, but their fellow Unitarians also by saying things like, well, the miracles ascribed to Jesus in the Bible, those didn't literally happen. Reason says that doesn't make any sense. Parker even went on to say that true religion would exist even if it turned out that Jesus had never lived. Try telling that to a fundamentalist even today. And then run away very, very quickly. But the Transcendentalists were also reacting against a sort of overly rational, dry worship and preaching style of the Unitarians of their time. They found it devoid of personal spiritual experience. Emerson even left his ministry and found what he clearly describes as transcendental experiences through self-reflection and nature. He wrote, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and particle of God." I've always thought that was a beautiful passage. Well, except for that transparent eyeball part. That's just kind of weird, isn't it? But he did go on to explain that as, I am nothing, I see all. And that sounds very similar to that sense of both dissolution of self and flowing or expansion outward toward a sense of unity that I mentioned earlier. Now, this influence is with us even today. Our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations lists 6 sources from which we draw spirituality and meaning. The very first source is stated like this: direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. And I think Emerson also handed down to us another tradition, and that tradition is to push back against the idea of a hierarchical or vertical transcendence, wherein our experience of it can only occur through a God who is up there somewhere and can only be mediated by the institution of the church or its religious authorities. That's how the little Southern Baptist church we went to when I was a kid was. God existed in some elevated holy realm while we sinners wallowed down in the physical realm. The preacher and the deacons at the front of the church were holier than the rest of us, so we weren't allowed to go up there unless it was to get saved, or I guess if we worked on the cleaning crew. The communion was brought to us lowly ones down in the pews. Now, even as a kid, I didn't like this. So one Sunday when I was 6 years old, the time in the service came where you could go up front and say that you had been saved that day. So up I went and got saved. I don't remember having any transcendent experience of Jesus washing my sins clean or anything like that. I think I just wanted to be up there with the holier-than-thou people, the cool kids. And please, no cracks in the receiving line about me later becoming a minister. Emerson believed in a very this-worldy God that, to oversimplify it a bit, was both the unity of all things and that also existed within all things. There was a spark of the divine in each of us, so we didn't necessarily need a church to experience transcendence. Jerome Stone, a current-day Unitarian Universalist theologian, takes this a step further by removing God from the experience altogether. From a religious perspective he calls religious naturalism, Stone speaks of these experiences as horizontal rather than vertical transcendence. He gives 2 examples. He tells a story of a time that he had just gotten a phone call letting him know that his dad had died. His daughter, who was 8 at the time, came into the room and saw him slumped into a chair, and she asked him what was the matter. He told her. She went over to the chair, climbed in, hugged him, and said, "Oh, Daddy." Stone says he had that experience of transcendence as is typically described, only its source was the gift of love and comfort offered by his daughter rather than the grace of some God. Likewise, he tells of having another of these experiences during the late 1960s. He was participating in weekly marches to demand a housing ordinance for racial equality in the city where he was busily attending graduate school. He said that he felt this transcendent pull to do so by a moral demand, but again, that transcendent moral demand wasn't coming from some God, it was coming from an internal sense of ethics and compassion. Interestingly, the theology that appeals greatly to me personally maintains this idea of horizontal transcendence, but also includes a concept of the divine. Process relational theology, to oversimplify a bit again, conceptualizes the divine as an ever-evolving process that is itself the sum total of every process of becoming or evolution and change throughout the entire universe. These processes of becoming include me, you, the rocks, the plants, all that is. We are all ever-changing and interconnected in ways that are beyond our normal everyday understanding. The divine, whether as a metaphor, seen as a metaphor or an actual presence, also holds all of the creative possibilities that are available to each of us in each moment. From this worldview, then, we experience transcendence when we get a glimpse of the true depth and complexity of that interconnectedness, a sense of deep belonging that drives in us a love for all of creation and that lures us toward creativity, justice, and beauty. It's a pretty theology, whether you agree with it or not. That's just a few of the ways that some Unitarian Universalists have thought about these experiences. There are many, many other ways of viewing them throughout the different world religions, and more recently through various psychological and neurological theories about them. So, as I thought about this first of our set of values, I struggled not so much with what their source might be or what may be going on inside in us with them, but instead, why they seem to be of such value to us. What do they do for us? I was reading shame and vulnerability researcher Dr. Brené Brown's latest book when I had a realization about these experiences that I really, really didn't want to accept at first. That happens to me a lot with Dr. Brown's work, so she pisses me off. And bless her for doing so. I think at least one of the things that we draw from these experiences is a greater capacity and willingness to allow our hearts to break wide open, an ability to love wholeheartedly, even though doing so will inevitably involve loss and heartbreak. A while back, it was a very cold night, so we had the fireplace going at my house. At the time, my spouse, Wayne, was suffering with the worst of some very serious, potentially life-threatening health issues. He was on the couch across from the fireplace with a blanket, sleeping. Our two ridiculously spoiled Basenji dogs had curled up on the couch beside him. It's funny how our animal friends know when we're not doing well. The dogs were 13 and 14, about as far as their life expectancy goes. I sat in a chair looking at them, thinking about the thousands of years that humans and dogs have been gathering by a fire and how a very similar scene must be playing out across the hemisphere in that very same moment. And I had that transcendent experience, that sense of deeper connection and belonging, a sense of both self-dissolving and expanding outward toward an ultimate love and a beautiful unity. And yet it was an aching beautiful, because my heart was breaking over the potential loss in my immediate, very real, everyday world. And my heart grew large enough to withstand such loss, filled up with a deep understanding that I wouldn't give up 1 minute of the pleasure and joy and love they have brought into my life. Now, I want you to know that Wayne is doing much, much better, and that so far the pups are still going, still spoiled, and still misbehaving. If we think back to all of the examples of these experiences that I have talked about just in this sermon, they all involve this sense of our hearts breaking wide open. Our folks in Housen Hall moved to tears by one another's stories. Jerome Stone's story of being offered grace by his young daughter over the loss of his own father. His story of participating in marches because the world as it was didn't live up to the world that he longed for. I think even Emerson's descriptions of experiencing transcendence through nature also involve this sense of loss, because we know it is all temporary. All the life around us will eventually end and be replaced, and even the very rocks in the hillsides will eventually dissolve away and be transformed into something new. Abraham Maslow, founder of humanistic psychology, called these peak experiences, and he thought that they generate a set of values within us that are more life-giving and life-fulfilling, that have to do with connection and belonging. I think he was right, and the research is starting to show that he was right. And if I'm correct, that these experiences help us to break our hearts wide open so that they can grow and can love more fully, even though we will know loss, then perhaps the biggest reason we put transcendence first on our list is because the rest of the values emerge out of it. It takes courage to love wholeheartedly, knowing our hearts will be broken and yet knowing that it is still worth it. Loving wholeheartedly is the very essence of compassion. It is the heart of the empathy required to create community. Together, these make up the ultimate reason I think we gather in community. Transformation, the growth that changes our lives and heals our world. Throughout time, ritual, prayer, music, poetry, meditation, art, singing, working together for justice, intentional silence. The things that we practice together here at this church have all been known to be capable of generating this state of transcendence. It's pretty fantastic then that we have chosen to value it so much. Hallelujah and amen.
Many of you know that I worked as a therapist for 15 years. And I talked to a lot of people who felt like failures. When we dug into that feeling, it seemed like anything less than world domination felt like a failure to some people. There were students who said they'd failed their exams, and it turned out, they got a B. And a lot of people felt like they were disappointments to their mom and dad, or the people that raised them. What did they want from you? I asked. Well, I guess they just wanted me to be perfect. But then when I would ask parents, what do you want from your kids? They would say, I just want them to be happy. There's disconnect. Most of us are way more critical of ourselves than almost anyone else is of us. We have an ugly little voice inside that says, stupid, idiot, clumsy, whatever. Things we say to ourselves, we would be reported if we talked to anybody else that way. But it's the mistakes that we make for some of us that glare at us when we look back or look around at our lives. We forgot to say something right, or we said something wrong, or we forgot to do something, or we did something that caused damage, or we didn't plan properly, or we didn't know something that we felt like we should know, but looking back, we couldn't have known, but we should have known anyway, so we feel like an idiot. We have damages we've done and businesses we've started that didn't make it, and times that we made mistakes in relationships, and times that we yelled at our children when we had resolved not to. I was not a big yeller. In fact, I was a fabulous mother, but there was this one time when my oldest child, he was about, 14 months old maybe, and he was a squealer. He would squeal when he was happy. He could clear a whole restaurant. And he liked to smack. I don't know, there was just a face. He would smack and just pat hard. And finally, I was just tired one day, and I'd had a long day at work, and, blah, blah, blah. And he was sitting right above me on a chair, and I was sitting on the floor, and we were playing, and he squealed right in my ear and smacked my head. And I turned around, and I screamed, "We do not scream, and we do not hit." The irony was apparent immediately. Parenthood is a minefield of mistakes just waiting to happen, and ones that you think you might make, and ones that you did make but you didn't notice. And speaking of all that, happy Mother's Day. And you really try, and you secretly suspect that you're going to do damage to your children without even knowing it, or that you did it already while they were still inside you, or that everything they do is your fault if it's bad, and that you should have known about all the things that they did that they now tell you now that they're in their 20s, that you didn't know at the time, even though they did everything they could to keep it from you for your own protection and peace of mind. But now we can tell you. And so I'm going to tell you in a couple of sentences how to be a good mother and a father. You ready? Here it is. They watch what you do. They don't listen to what you say. I mean, they do, but they more watch what you do. And so just be the kind of person you want them to be. You want them to be polite? Be polite to them. You want them to learn please and thank you? Say please and thank you to them. You want them to be honest and trustworthy and energetic and useful in the world? Model that. If you find yourself in a situation that's confusing, sometimes it's clarifying to say, what would I want my children to do if they were in a situation such as this? That's actually why I got a divorce from their dad. I thought, if they are in marriages that are like this, what would I want them to do? I know. Back to my therapy office. I had a cartoon on the wall. I'm not a big cartoon person, but this cartoon was of Glinda the Good Witch at her therapist's office. And she was lying on the couch, and her therapist was there taking notes. And she said, one wants a heart and one wants a brain, and it's just too much. And underneath the caption is, Glinda learns to be the good enough witch. Some of us will go to great lengths to avoid making a mistake. Some of us will even avoid trying new things that we don't already know how to do, because sometimes we feel like we should already know how to do them, even though we never learned them. Those are mostly firstborn and only children that feel like that. Some of us grew up with people who would say things like, I'm never wrong, except that one time in 1995 when I thought I was wrong, but I wasn't. My family joked that on my grandfather's headstone should be, often in error, never in doubt. Sometimes we make the same mistakes over and over again, knowing they're mistakes, knowing that it didn't work last time, it didn't work the time before that, it didn't work the time before that, but we're going to try it just one more time because this is a familiar mistake, and the situation it gets you into is kind of odd but familiar, and it might be too scary to do something different. But the world's best wisdom tells us that mistakes are part of learning. Thomas Edison said, I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that don't work. Danish Nobel Prize winner Niels Bohr says, an expert is a person who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. The drive to avoid mistakes can lead to a certain kind of success. In certain fields, not ever making a mistake is a good thing. For example, 21 out of the first 23 NASA astronauts were firstborn children. 21 out of 23. Because you have to just be perfect and short enough. Because it's a small place you have to get into. Not so with inventors. Inventors have to be flexible about mistakes, kind of sanguine about finding stuff out by accident. So inventors are not all firstborns. There are a lot of people who just like experimenting in there. I remember working with my oldest son on this little puzzle. You've seen it. It's 9 dots in a square. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And you have to connect all the dots with a straight line without lifting your pencil from the paper. We struggled for about 7 minutes, which is all the attention span either one of us had for struggling. And we couldn't figure it out. We were getting ready to give up, and the younger son came over and said, "What are you doing?" We told him, and he went, "Oh, here." And he picked up the pencil, and he drew a line, and then he went, shockingly, way above the little square of dots, and came back down again, and they were all connected. And we were like, "You went outside the box." That wasn't a rule that you had to stay in there. We just pretended, made it up. We made up that there was a rule, that there wasn't really a rule. We just didn't think about it. This congregation is vigorously living our mission. We're trying to figure out whether we want to be a sanctuary church or whether we want to be a church that occasionally does sanctuary and has a refugee living here, or whether we want to be a church that maybe accompanies refugees to their appointments to try to strengthen their case enough so that they don't have to leave their family and their home in order to come to the church to be in sanctuary. We are not sure, and there are no best practices because nobody else is doing this almost. We're almost the only ones doing this. Our sister church, St. Andrew's Presbyterian, is doing it now. So together, we have to figure it out. And we might make a mistake. And when we make a mistake, we're going to go, we made a mistake. This isn't working. Let's try something else. We're moving forward on a plan for building renovation and expansion. We're using the best expertise that we know how to get. We hired great experts out of Washington, D.C. for our fundraising, and we raised at the tippy top of the range that churches can raise. 5 times annual giving. You all did it. And so now we have this budget, which is constrained, and we have these architects, and we're trying to make our dream happen with limited money. Are we going to spend all the money just perfectly? We're going to try. Might we make a mistake? You bet. Just look forward to it. Anytime you are together with other people trying to do something, you're going to make mistakes. And it has to be okay. There has to be room in most processes for making a mistake. If you're a medical person, there's a lot less room for making mistakes, and I'm sorry about that. But as soon as you get home, you can make mistakes. In our house, we say to each other, we're allowed 4 mistakes a day. That the other person sees. So what do you do when you make a mistake? You say, that was a mistake. You look at how much of the responsibility of making the mistake was yours. Err on the side of it being too much yours, because you're the only person you can do anything about. And so you say, I'm sorry. You try to heal that part of yourself that led to the mistake. You try to become better in here because whatever's in here is going to come out. So we don't just try to watch what we say so we don't say anything hurtful. You have to watch way before that. You know what I mean? You have to become the kind of person who is non-harming in their speech to other people. It's It's a little bit harder than just watching what you say. I read this week about a prayer called the Ho'oponopono prayer, done in Hawaii by a psychiatrist. Anyway, most of his story I don't believe, but I love the prayer that he came up with, which is, I'm sorry, forgive me, thank you, I love you. A lot of times we have to say that to ourselves because a lot of the mistakes we make just damage us. And so you can just put your hand on your heart and say, I'm sorry, forgive me, thank you, I love you. So the beauty of working with yourself on a thought level, on a love level, is you don't need to watch what you say. You can make mistakes. You can be around people who might make you uncomfortable because you're worried that you might say something wrong. We like to be perfectly correct in how we deal with people who are unfamiliar to us. But a lot of times if you're actually around people of a different culture or a different gender identification or different sexual orientation or something, you're going to say something like, Happy Cinco de Mayo, I'm eating a taco bowl, I love Hispanics. And then you just have to say, I'm sorry. So go ahead and put yourself in situations where you might say something wrong and someone might have to call you back into correct relationship and healthy relationship. It's okay. You're going to make mistakes. I had a dear friend who she used a wheelchair and she was fierce. She never let anything go by. And I said, Helen, I'm terrified to talk to you because I'm going to say something wrong. And she said, yes, you will. She said, but it's okay. I will tell you about it, and you'll say I'm sorry, and you'll learn something, and I'll forgive you. Then, oh, that was relaxing. And so I want to say, for the mistakes I've made with you all, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Thank you. I love you.